I love the Beatles. This Beatles poster has been hanging next to my bed literally since I was a child. This is my Beatles vinyl record collection, and I don't even own a record player. As a child, the Beatles were honestly some of the only music I listened to. I practically worshipped the Beatles. So of all people, why am I making a video called Stop Worshipping the Beatles? Because it's become increasingly clear that for some people, the Beatles need to be put into some badly needed context. Right now, the Beatles are held up as this sort of consecrated paragon of excellence. A divinely inspired holy grail whose unique accomplishments no one has achieved since. And to some extent, this is true. There is an unmatched library of scholarly literature about this band. From books to documentaries to literal entire college courses. There was a $26 million feature film that basically presented the Beatles' discography as this godlike music with automatic powers to move millions. It's safe to say that no artist since has achieved notoriety quite like this. That said, with the popularity of Taylor Swift's Eras Tour, some believe this might be changing. Might. With her ability to draw crowds and streams in a way the world has never seen before, some onlookers have started to compare Taylor Swift's remarkable achievements to those of the Beatles. This was encapsulated by this May 2024 New York Times article directly comparing the two. Now, to put it mildly, certain online communities have been, let's say, very hostile toward this comparison.
The Beatles, they changed pop culture. Taylor is just part of pop culture.
No, as well written as these Taylor Swift songs are, you can't compare them to songs like Lady Madonna or a song like I'm the Walrus.
What makes the Beatles amazing is their resonance 70 years or 60 years later. Are they going to be doing documentaries in 50 years on Taylor Swift?
Taylor Swift and the Beatles? How dare you compare them? Some people seem to have this very guttural, negative reaction toward comparisons made between the two. To them, the mere suggestion that Taylor Swift's artistry and fame could even hold a candle to the Beatles is immediately dismissed out of hand.
It's like comparing planet Earth with planet Zotron 99-1982.
But why? Why are the Beatles regarded as such untouchable musical warlocks? With her hundreds of packed stadiums and record-breaking music sales in the age of streaming, why are Taylor Swift's accomplishments still not comparable to the Beatles? It's time to have a frank discussion about the Beatles. What they did, what they didn't do, and how they came to achieve this rather unique status of musical reverence. I think this is obvious, but the Beatles wrote some pretty incredible music. Every song on this list, I think, is objectively a generational masterpiece. The sheer amount of hits these guys were able to put out in only 8 years is nothing short of remarkable. The Beatles were masters of keeping audiences on their toes. Every album they put out felt like a brand new adventure, and not a single one was a complete flop. For better or for worse, and we'll talk more about that later, the Beatles did play a huge role in bringing rock and roll to a mainstream audience. The Beatles literally invented the stadium concert. They had so much leverage over these venues that they often forced them to desegregate their audience. In their later years, the Beatles absolutely innovated the art of music production. Lush orchestral arrangements, intricate sonic engineering, the use of Foley sound effects. These had all been done before, but never in a way that appealed to a mainstream pop audience. I have nothing but the utmost respect for what the Fab Four were able to accomplish during their tenure. The thing is though, and we have to ask this, were they completely unique? Guys, if we're gonna be honest, the answer is no, not really. The Beatles were huge, but were they the only musical giants of the time? Of course not. The 1960s were wild. You had massive artists like the Supremes, Led Zeppelin, and James Brown, to name a few. The Beatles absolutely killed it on the pop music charts, but Are they the most successful musical artists of all time? By some metrics, no actually. Mariah Carey, Rihanna, and even Drake have all spent considerably more time in the Billboard singles #1 spot. The Beatles absolutely deserve credit for popularizing stadium concerts. No question there. But I think something that is not widely known is that, for the most part, these concerts kinda sucked. We tend to remember the most iconic concerts like Shea Stadium, Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Budokan. But why do we never hear about the Beatles live at Candlestick Park? This was the last stadium concert the Beatles ever played, and it didn't even sell out. The venue dropped ticket prices as low as $4, and still there were around 7,000 tickets left unsold. And if you look at the actual quality of these concerts, it's easy to see why people weren't going to them. The Beatles concerts were famously replete with fans who had no interest in listening to or enjoying the music, but just wanted to scream and ogle at these four handsome young lads. The screaming was so loud that the Beatles reportedly couldn't even hear themselves singing.
The noise was constant.
Yeah.
It never abates.
No.
I mean, at first that screaming was great because it meant we were a success. It was just like, she loves, and it's like, hey, whoa. And after a while it was like, I can't hear you.
Even at some of the more iconic shows, some fans were not too thrilled about the noise levels. There were other problems as well, such as poor audio quality, poor promotion, and some really bizarre and random opening acts, like symphony orchestras. Like, imagine in 1966 going to rock out to the Beatles, but not before a distinguished performance from the San Francisco Symphony. Ah, what a time. These concerts were really short as well. A lot of people just didn't think it was worth the drive to watch the Beatles play for only 30 minutes. By their last tour, these stadium concerts were hemorrhaging money for venues. It was so bad that the Beatles had to stop playing live concerts entirely and shift their focus to the studio.
They were not playing great, and that's why we all had a discussion, and in '66, that was it. And we didn't know. We went in the studio, messed about a bit, and hey, turned out fine.
The Beatles undeniably made massive contributions to classic rock and roll, but did they really innovate the genre in any major way? Again, if we're gonna be fully honest, not really, at least not in the early days. I know it can be uncomfortable, but it's important that we have an honest discussion about music and race. Rock and roll was born out of the blues tradition of the 1950s from artists like Rosetta Tharpe, Little Richard, Luther Dixon, and Chuck Berry.
Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, didn't it?
Like jazz, blues, and hip-hop, rock and roll is a Black American art form, full stop. Now, the Beatles wrote some wonderful rock and roll music, but as far as pure innovations, most techniques they used had been done before by black artists. White audiences at the time, many of whom never cared for these black artists, now found themselves enthralled from hearing this group of white boys play what is essentially black-influenced music. The Beatles themselves never claimed to have innovated rock and roll. Growing up, they absolutely idolized great black artists.
James Jamerson was my big influence on bass.
Early Beatles records even contained covers of Luther Dixon and Chuck Berry. The Beatles couldn't dance. The Beatles couldn't act. They were great singers, but they were no Frank Sinatra. They rocked hard, but not quite like Jimi Hendrix. They had good charisma, but not quite like Elvis or James Brown. I would not for a second deny the Beatles' greatness. The question I'm trying to explore is, how did they achieve such a godly level of reverence that they have today? Without taking away their accomplishments, the Beatles have, by the numbers, been outdone on the charts, on the stage, and arguably in the realm of innovation. This YouTube commenter mentions the fact that the Beatles would have had more #1 hits if not for the fact that their own music was blocking the #1 spot. Want to know who else had that exact same problem? None other than Taylor Swift. Swift's 2024 album, The Tortured Poets Department, set a world record by claiming the top 14 spots on the Billboard Hot 100. She could have potentially had 13 more #1 hits. Pop concerts today are so much better than they were in the 1960s. The Beatles had thousands of deafeningly loud screaming fans. And you know who else does? Charlie XCX. A few months ago, I was lucky enough to get to see Charlie XCX live at Ball Arena in Colorado. Anyway, I assure you that at times, the crowd was probably just as loud as any Beatles concert. It got to the point that I had to plug my ears just to enjoy the music. No, it wasn't this constant, non-stop wall of screams like the Beatles had. But Charlie's concert was also about 3 times longer, so I'm not sure the crowd could have kept that up anyway. And if they had, I probably would have just left, because does that really sound like a fun time to you? In their later years, the Beatles absolutely made some very impressive musical innovations. But you know who else has? Black Sabbath, T.I., Future, Dr. Dre, Skrillex, Beyonce, Billie Eilish, and so many more. So with all this said, why do some people find it so offensive to compare a modern pop artist like Taylor Swift to the Beatles? How did the Beatles achieve this legendary status that is considered so far above what anybody is doing today? To answer this question, I'm going to talk about the time I was almost kicked out of summer camp. Stick with me here, I swear this is relevant. It was the summer of 2013, and I was but a wee young lad attending the Interlochen Center for the Arts summer camp. Now, my parents paid good money for me to be there, so getting kicked out would have been a pretty flipping big deal. Anyway, on a Sunday morning, my buddy Frankie and I spent close to an hour taking turns trying to steal a candy bar from the vending machine using a coat hanger. After what seemed like forever, Frankie was finally able to fish out a Snickers bar. As Frankie ate away at his stolen Snickers bar, I distinctly remember him just raving about how insanely delicious this candy bar was. I even asked him for a bite, and I don't even like Snickers that much. If you're wondering, by the way, we got caught because some other random kid snitched on us. Anyway, my point is this. We humans have a deep craving for what we can't have. We desire to possess the unobtainable. Whether it's a candy bar, a fun experience, or our favorite artist's music, the more out of reach something is, the more we want it. In psychology, this is known as the Scarcity Principle. The Beatles publicly broke up in 1970, leaving the world shocked and confused. But by doing so, they unwittingly cemented themselves as the musical legends we know them as today. The biggest band in the world, at the top of their game, suddenly just ceased to exist. For an entire decade, the world eagerly awaited every album release, each one being better than the last. Up until the very end, the hits just never stopped coming. But with John Lennon's departure in 1969 and Paul McCartney's surprise solo debut in 1970, we would never get another Beatles album again. In rap battles, there's a concept known as the mic drop.
Ain't nobody gonna mess with my education!
To quote Wikipedia, a mic drop is the gesture of intentionally dropping one's microphone at the end of a performance or speech to signal triumph. When you drop the mic, what you're really signaling to the audience is, I came, I'm done, I'm out. This is usually followed by a hoot and a holler from the audience, at least if your bars were good. I'm not here to dissect the Beatles' breakup. People have spent literal decades researching this topic. But whether they knew it or not, by breaking up at their peak, the Beatles may have committed, metaphorically, the biggest mic drop the world has ever seen. Back in 2007, there was this huge song on the radio called This Is Why I'm Hot by Mims.
This is why I'm hot.
I cannot express how big this song was. You could not escape it.
I'm hot cause I'm fly. You ain't cause you not.
Now, if you've never heard of this song or artist before, it's probably because Mims left the music industry in 2009 to pursue app development, less than 2 years after his smashing success. Looking at the comments section today for This Is Why I'm Hot, it's basically just turned into a graveyard of memes. Dude disappeared off the face of the earth. He got so hot he evaporated and we never got part 2, Lamau. But what underlies a lot of these comments is an aura of respect. Mims came by, told us he was hot, and left. Now, imagine instead of just one random hit, Mims had dozens of hits over the span of 8 years, brought rock and roll to a new audience, and massively contributed to the revolutionizing of recording technology. And that's how you get the Beatles. There is, unfortunately, another much darker angle to this. It's a very sensitive topic, so I apologize if I come across the wrong way. But I do believe that the tragic deaths of John Lennon and George Harrison further secured the Beatles' legendary status. If we were sure we wouldn't get any more Beatles music after 1970, we were really sure after the passing of these two cornerstones of the band. John Lennon's death was especially heartbreaking, given how sudden and unexpected it was. I think Paul and Ringo probably made the right call by not touring as the Beatles after the passing of their bandmates.
To me, it was sort of end of an era. Sort of really wrapped up the Beatles thing, kind of thing, for me.
This argument I'm putting forth begs an interesting thought experiment. What if the Beatles had never broken up and John Lennon and George Harrison never died? Would they still have the same reputation today? Well, Alternate History Hub, there's one video you haven't made, so let's speculate now. As solo artists, the Beatles had some bangers for sure. Imagine, Live and Let Die, My Sweet Lord, these all come to mind. But as alternate historians, we have to be brutally honest here. I adore Paul McCartney, but how many songs can you name off of his 1971 album Ram? If it's more than one, you've already got me beat. It's a similar story for all four of the guys. Make no mistake, their songwriting chops were still very solid, it just wasn't Beatles level. If the Beatles had continued as a band into the 70s and 80s, their fate in all likelihood would have been the same as every other band that sticks around past its prime. Their popularity would have started to dwindle. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Supremes, the Four Seasons, these are all bands that achieved peak stardom in the 60s and stuck around past their prime. Now that is completely within their right to do. In fact, it's probably what I would do in their situation. These bands are all very well respected and thought of quite highly. But let's be honest, none of these bands have anywhere near the level of veneration the Beatles have today. I guarantee that if you were to compare the success of Taylor Swift to that of Diana Ross, there would not be a slew of cranky old men attacking you for it.
No, as well written as these Taylor Swift songs are, you can't compare them to
Diana Ross and the Supremes.
Obviously, comparing Taylor Swift to the Beatles is not a perfect comparison. Literally, the guy who wrote the New York Times article even said that. The Beatles undoubtedly set some milestones that Taylor Swift will probably never achieve, like introducing an up-and-coming genre to the world, revolutionizing how pop concerts are done, or even major innovations made in the studio. But Taylor Swift has also accomplished things that the Beatles never dreamed of, like packing 60,000 plus capacity venues on 5 different continents, or owning the top 14 spots on the Billboard Hot 100, or, for example, having longevity like the world has never seen before. Taylor Swift has been one of the top actively performing musicians in the public eye for nearly 20 years. Maybe the Beatles could have done that, but they didn't. While researching for this video, I got to interview my Aunt Joan and my Uncle Arkady. They both grew up in the 1960s, but have slightly different memories of Beatlemania.
Ну, Beatles был просто above everybody. Это Beatles был просто где-то совсем. А потом, после Beatles'ов, появились такие, как Animals, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple, Rolling Stone. Rolling Stone был после Beatles'ов.
To Arkady, the Beatles were this absolutely next-level band. Meanwhile, I asked Aunt Joan the exact same question.
They were, a new phenomena. We did have a TV and watch Ed Sullivan, and, they were just coming up then. So, yes, everybody, was Beatlemania, basically.
In Joan's memory, the Beatles were also an incredibly influential band. top of the game for sure. But to her, the Beatles were just one of many great pop artists of the time.
There's like one artist that really stands out in my mind that I remember listening to all the time was the Monkees. You know, I think when I was like in elementary school, you know, the Stones and the Beatles were just coming up. I know I listened to them, but I don't remember like as much as the Monkees.
So, what gives? Why were the Beatles already legendary in the 60s to some people, but not quite so much to others? Aunt Joan grew up in the United States, where the Beatles were ubiquitous. She was mere minutes away from Shea Stadium when the iconic Beatles concert was happening. But when I asked if she even knew about it at the time...
No, I really don't. I don't remember. I mean, you're telling me, and that is giving me a vague recollection, but not really, no.
Meanwhile, Arkady grew up in the Soviet Union, where Western music was banned.
Считалось, что это западная пропаганда, и правительство не хотело, чтобы ты это слушал. Не было никакой торговли, не было ничего такого, что ты мог слушать. Только если кто-то привез и кто-то переписал, recorded. Да, на кассетах.
In my opinion, the Beatles were already legendary in the USSR for the exact same reason they later became legendary to the rest of us. We humans want things we can't have. Plain and simple. And when one of those things is an insanely awesome pop band that ruled their decade, they become legends.
They struck a chord because they are so just, you know, teeny bop, just so universal. Their music is universal. It's just like really easy music to love.
Teeny bop music that the whole family can enjoy. Wait a second. Who else does that describe? If that is not the most apt description of Taylor Swift I've ever heard, then I don't know what is. Bottom line is this. Is it reasonable to compare Taylor Swift to the Beatles? Hell yeah, it's reasonable. Obviously, these were very different eras, and comparing vinyl record sales to Spotify streams is not exactly ideal. But by that standard, you can never compare the influence of any musicians from different periods. And I think that's just lame. It is completely fine, dare I say even warranted, to compare the cultural dominion of today's dominant pop stars to the dominant pop stars of the past. There is one thing I've kind of glossed over. One crucial thing that the Beatles have accomplished that Taylor Swift has not, which is that the Beatles have stood the test of time. The Beatles' music has been passed down for generations and is beloved pretty much by all. Looking at the comments section of some of these videos, this seems to be one of the top reasons why Taylor Swift is just not Beatles level. In that sense, I see where people are coming from. The thing we have to remember, though, is that Taylor Swift hasn't really had the chance yet. As of recording this video, her oldest song is only 18 years old. Is it possible that Taylor Swift fades into obscurity? That her music gets lost to the winds of time? Sure. Is it possible that 50 years from now, everybody's grandchildren will be singing You Belong With Me? Yes. We just don't know yet. Personally, I fully intend on showing future generations the incredible artistry of the Beatles and Taylor Swift. You can personally decide what to show your grandchildren, but in the present moment, it's time to give Taylor the credit she deserves. Hey! Now that you've watched the whole video, go listen to my album. You won't regret it. Link in description. Thanks, bye!